And through the night vision, I see a dark silhouette of what looks like an ape on all fours come up. And it reaches up and grabs the door on the well house and proceeds to pull the door off. And I see the little ape-looking thing come back, and then there's a second one with it. Then all of a sudden, this huge dark mass follows them. And that well house is about 8 feet tall, and whatever was taller. And I am certain it's probably the same one that I saw across the road in 2009.
Before we get started with this show, consider this your final warning. I'll be at Small Town Monsters Monster Fest in beautiful Canton, Ohio this Saturday, June 3rd. Do not miss it. It's going to be a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. You'll be able to see Bigfoot Society live, 10:30 a.m. Central Standard Time. Do not miss that. I'll be interviewing Martin Grove, the amazing dogman / Bigfoot researcher, Land Between the Lakes, Kentucky. You're going to love it. And please, if you're there, track me down and say hi. And if you've got a Bigfoot story, I want to hear it. Or we'll get something set up for later. Again, I want to see you at Monster Fest. Go to smalltownmonsters.com to get your tickets as quick as you can and everything else you need. All right, let's get into the show. But before we do, Canton, Ohio is in Eastern Standard Time, not Central, which is Iowa time. So 10:30 Eastern Standard Time, EST. Don't miss it because I just messed up. I'll see you there, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Beautiful Canton, Ohio. Let's go. Thanks for coming back for another episode. We've got Jim Whitehead from the Mid-America Bigfoot Research Center with us tonight. And how's it going today, Jim?
Yeah, it's going all right.
Awesome. And you're down there in the great state of Oklahoma, right?
Yes, I am.
Oh, that's great. We were talking earlier, and you'd mentioned that your main research area is in the western part of the state of Oklahoma. And I think it's about time that I chat with someone about the western part of Oklahoma, because I've talked a lot about southeastern, as you can imagine. That's everyone kind of focuses in on that. But Jim, tell me, what has the western part of the state got going on with Bigfoot research that people might not realize?
Number one, I would say probably the fact that there's actually Bigfoot out there. Everybody tends to hone in on the eastern part of the state because it's more wooded, but the thing is the western half of the state's actually far less populated. There's a history of sightings basically west of the I-35 corridor in the state going back for quite a ways. In fact, some of the earliest sightings in the state actually happened on that end, but people are none the wiser about it.
That's very interesting. Is that anything you'd be able to share with us tonight as we're talking?
Sure. Actually, I've been working on putting together a chronology for pre-1958 sightings in Oklahoma as of late, and I can pull this up and I can share a few of these old sightings with you.
Great.
Just a second here. Okay. One of the oldest sightings in the state actually came from the Dragoon expeditions with Major Henry Leavenworth. And okay, it really wasn't a sighting. It was more of a encounter with evidence. But basically, these guys were out in what would have been far western Oklahoma, and they were talking about what they were calling prairie grizzlies and how they were weird. And this would have been about 1835, but they were describing the prairie grizzlies as hunting in packs, making nests, and ambushing deer and breaking their necks, and stuff we would really attribute with Bigfoot today. And they reported finding giant bear tracks that were in somewhere in the realm of 18, 17 inches in length. And it's not very hard to stretch that into that being Bigfoot. Yes, it was part of basically it was another part of the Corps of Discovery expedition that Lewis and Clark were on. They had 4 of those expeditions, but then they also had Dragoon expeditions, which were oversaw more by the military men, but it was still part of the same program.
Is that the only historical event of Bigfoot pre-1958, or are there others as well?
Oh, there's plenty more. Perfect example, Rachel Plummer, who was a sister of Quanah Parker, I believe. She was actually captured by Comanches down in Texas, and they took her into the mountains in southwest Oklahoma, the Wichita Mountains today, which used to be called the Sierra Jamon Mountains by the Spanish fur trappers. And by the way, the Spanish fur trappers, they actually talked about things in the mountains they called lobosomes, basically werewolves. But the Rachel Plummer, this would have been about 1836, so just a year later, she eventually escaped and came back to civilization, so to speak. And what she had to say was she basically gave this really detailed account of everything that she saw and heard from the Comanche. And in the mountains, they told her about a hairy, giant wild man that was very terrifying, could use small trees as clubs. And she said she didn't see it, but she said the Comanche tribe that she was with, that particular band, said that they had encountered them in the mountains several times. And this would have been near modern day Lawton.
Wow. That is intense. Are these accounts you can find in normal history books, or is there a certain book that you've found these in, or?
I've found them all across history books, historical narratives where they would go out and interview people. There's a great program with the University of Oklahoma where it's called the Oklahoma Indian Pioneer Papers. And they would actually go out and interview these people right around 1900 to 1910. And they were interviewing all these people that were pushing 100 years old and listening to their stories. And there are some interesting stories in those papers. There's stories from the Arbuckle Mountains in central Oklahoma. There was one woman that grew up near Davis named Amanda Kimball. She was an African-American woman, and she was talking about how the bears would get into the corn at night. And she said you'd see the bears walk out there, and they would gather up bundles of corn under each arm, I should say, not paws, not you just sit there and eat the corn with their mouth, arms. And then they would walk back out of the field, and they would step over the fence like a man, and they would walk on 2 legs.
Oh my goodness. And these stories are just hidden in this folklore project of the university. And you've been smart enough to find these accounts.
If one is really willing to start poking into the history of it, there is a lot of stuff out there.
Jim, how long have you been in the subject of Bigfoot for?
I officially have been researching since 2006 and joined the MABRC in 2008, I believe it was. The area I grew up in, we had a local legend about a monster, and I knew plenty of people that had seen it when I was a boy. So there was always that underlying interest.
I love local legends. Regional Bigfoot stories are some of my favorite. Did it have a name?
Oh, yeah. Everybody out there called it. It had several names over the years looking back. Initially, The earliest reports in that region just simply referred to it as the wild Indians. They would say there were two kinds of Indians. They said they were the kinds that wore clothes and you could talk to them, and then there were the kinds that were hairy, naked, and ran around in the woods and would sneak up on your farm and steal chickens at night. Over time, we had it somehow became known as the HellBeast in the late 1800s.
The HellBeast? Whoa, man, nice.
Yeah. And eventually it became known as the Criner Creature.
I like it. I like that. I can't believe I've never heard that one. That's great.
Yeah, the HellBeast was an interesting story because what I heard in the locals, what I heard from some of the old timers that actually told me about it in the area was that essentially it was, there was a Choctaw man that his family got murdered and he went out and got a bloody revenge. And then supposedly they said that he'd grown so cold and hateful because of the act that he changed into a monster, according to the folklore version. Now, the truth is the guy actually just left the area. He painful memories and whatnot. His story was actually recorded in the Oklahoma, or not the Oklahoma, there was a True Tales of the West magazine. It was an old magazine. And he just left and went to go live with some family on the other side of the state. But the fact that there's this local legend tells you that people were trying to explain sightings of something.
Fascinating. And when you're growing up, do you remember events that would include that creature while you're growing up? Do you remember any of that from your childhood?
Oh, yeah. There were two guys that were living out there on the land, Tony and George, and they were pretty much making a living trapping and living off what they raised. And they heard something out in their hen house, and they went out to check it out, and they thought it was a coyote. And when they were going out to the hen house, something came out of the hen house and stood up with chickens under both arms. And it was way bigger than they were. And they proceeded to empty both barrels of the shotgun they had directly into it from about 5 to 6 foot away. The creature dropped to the ground, rolling, screaming, and it took off, ran right through a barbed wire fence. And they followed the blood trail for quite a ways. It petered out, and they figured it'd hold up somewhere up in the woods and died. But yeah, the next day there was blood and chunks of meat on the ground where it got blasted. This would have been right in late 70s, early 80s. Then my brother was actually hunting. Yeah, he actually had several encounters. He was hunting up in a creek called Mushroom Gully, and it's just a spring-fed creek. It's not too far from the old homestead. And he was going out at night coon hunting, and the dogs became really afraid. He was practically tripping over them. And what Tim said was that he had the feeling he was getting watched, so he decided to get a better vantage point. And he got up on one of the banks and looked around, and standing across, he said he first thought it was a bear. And then it reached up and grabbed a branch. It's this huge 8 foot tall, hairy humanoid thing. And that scared him bad enough that he actually went further up the creek and then doubled back because he didn't want that thing following him home. Another time we had a farm pond, a couple of big farm ponds out on the old place, and he built a float house. And he didn't see it, but something climbed up on that float house and walked around with him in it, and it dang near tipped the thing over. And it was just like think of it like one of those little pre-made storage buildings, but it was basically, he made it himself out of scrap lumber. It wasn't very big. And then going back, I found out that my dad had an encounter would have been the late 30s, early 40s. He was sweet on a girl that lived probably about 2 miles from there, and he would ride his pony up to her house. Officially, he was going to play cards, but he was coming back one day, and it was when he crossed Mushroom Gully, something big and black jumped out of the brush along the creek and proceeded to chase him. And he rode the pony all the way back to the house and jumped off, ran into the house, left the pony out in the yard. And I didn't find this out until years after his death, when his brother, my uncle, actually told me the story.
Is this creature still causing havoc today too?
That was one of my primary research areas and still is, we'll put it that way. And I have collected a lot of sightings in that area. It's one little tiny town, and you go there. I mean, the population in the town itself is probably less than 150 people, but you go there and the locals, a lot of newer people that have moved in, they won't know anything about it, but you talk to the old timers that have lived there, and just about everybody's got a story. They've either seen it or they know somebody who has, but it's not something they talk about openly. It's one of those, you ask them about it, they'll look around to see if anybody's listening, and then they'll talk if they think that nobody's listening.
Have you ever had a close encounter with it yourself?
Yes. On several occasions, actually. There was some stuff that happened when I was a kid that I kind of had pushed back to the back of my mind. But I had a red-bone hound that got tore apart.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I would have been about 6, 7 at the time. And my mother actually found the dog, and she went up to go get it, and she was coming back and something was following her, but she couldn't see it due to the thick fog. No birds, no bugs, nothing. And about that same time, I was a little bitty fart, and something looked in my window at night and scared the crap out of me. But really, I got back into it about 2006 when I was going out to feed dogs. I worked at a warehouse up in Oklahoma City, and it was almost an hour's drive back home. And I'd get off at 2 a.m. So I get back there about 3, and we had a really foggy weather system moving in. It was extremely foggy, and I had a couple of dogs out in the pen by the creek, and I'd go out there to feed them when I got home. And one night it was real pea soup fog, and when I went out there, I could not see 5 foot in front of me, but I could hear something moving around. We had a llama out there in the pasture at the time, and I thought it was the llama. But when I got to the dog pens, I noticed the dogs were terrified. They were in the corner, shaking, trembling. And right then it clued me in that something was wrong. And I called the llama, and it gave an alarm call up on the hill as far away from the creek as it could possibly get. So whatever this was, probably less than 20 feet away from me, but I couldn't see it. And I knew it wasn't the llama. At the time, I didn't know what it was. I grabbed a shovel that I had leaning up against the dog pen because I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know if it was going to attack me or what. And me and whatever this was circled each other in the fog until I made my way back to the fence and hopped the fence and went back to the house. And I couldn't find any tracks. The ground was pretty hard at the time. And the next day and the day after it happened again, whatever this was out there waiting for me. But on the 4th night when I got out there, the fog actually lifted. And when I went out there, I heard it take off up the creek. I could hear splash, splash, splash. I thought, okay, this thing's going to have stepped in the mud. It's going to leave prints. I'm going to know what this thing is in the morning. So I went out there in the morning, and I saw 15-inch 5-toed tracks in the mud. and there's nobody else down in that bottom except for my 80-year-old uncle and aunt at the time, and I know it wasn't them. And then I got to researching it after that, and I pretty much did everything that you probably shouldn't do as a researcher because I was new at the time. And I was driving down the road one day, and I happened to see one on the side of the road in the daylight. It was actually eating willow leaves, of all things. I slowed down and looked at it, and it puffed up a bit at me like an angry teenager. But yeah, that whole account's actually in David Paulides' Tribal Bigfoot book. But yeah, since then I've actually had a few encounters in a few different research areas. So I guess I'm lucky in that regard.
You see the Bigfoot on the side of the road. Can you still picture its face in your mind when you close your eyes? So what do you see in Jim when you're looking at it?
Honestly, it looks very human, but I wouldn't say modern. It looks very archaic, very pre-Homo sapiens hominid type face. Heavy brow ridges, broad, wide nose. The skin color was dark, almost grayish. It was covered with reddish hair. The top of it was going gray. It almost kind of like a silverback gorilla, but I remember there was a bright patch of red hair on the top of the head. It was probably about I'd say about 7 foot, maybe a little over. But the thing that got me is it was really stocky. This thing was 7 foot, but it was probably about 3 feet wide. It was a wall. And that wasn't the only sighting I've had in that location. Another night I was driving home. Again, late nights, I was working up in the city. And that same creek system, when I was crossing it, something much larger than the one I'd seen ran across the road. And it ducked. There was a willow tree on the side of the road, the same one that one had been pulling branches off of. And it actually fell down a few years ago. But the thing that ran across the road ducked to get under a low-hanging branch. And it cleared the road in about 2 strides and slid down a rocky embankment. And I could just see a big, dark silhouette figure. The eyes were shining. I could see a bit of hair on the legs. And the sighting was over in just a few seconds. And I guess that's far more typical of most people's encounters. But I went back the next day because I knew it ducked under that branch to see how tall it was. And I measured that branch right at 9 feet off the ground. So whatever that was had to duck to get under a 9 feet branch, meaning it was comparable in height. And then I checked the rocky embankment. It slid down, and I found hair.
Really?
And I took the hair to a lab. I've still got some of it. I did some testing on it at the college. It resembled human pubic hair, but it was about 5 to 6 inches long and straight. And I showed it to the biologist at the time, the head biologist there was one of the members of the Oklahoma Academy of Science. He was one of the board members. And this guy's got 60 years of experience with the wildlife in the state. He couldn't identify it. He couldn't think of anything in the state that it would be. Now, there was a group out of Texas that had came up to El Reno, and they got a hair sample. And this location's probably about 80, 90 miles from where the location that I had this sighting. But they sent theirs off to multiple labs, and they kept getting unknown. They sent it off for genetic testing, and The stuff that they got back actually stated that it was an unknown genome. It wasn't in zoobank, meaning it's an unrecognized species. So they gave me a little bit of their hair. And when I compared the hair that I'd collected and the hair that they had collected under a microscope, they were a match. The scale pattern was the same. The thickness was the same. The overall morphology was the same. There was a slight difference in coloration. That was it. So whatever their unknown is, I can quite confidently say that my unknown was more than likely the same thing.
How long ago did this happen again, Jim?
That would have been 2009, I believe.
That's wild. Bigfoot. That's okay. So that's just long enough for people to forget about stuff, isn't it? Oh, man, that feels like that should be bigger news. That sounds like a really big deal, Jim. Wow. Has that ever been written about in anything? Or?
It was posted on their website. In fact,
oh, wow.
It's still on there, I believe.
Okay.
Not my end of it, but their lab results are.
Sure. What do you personally feel that we're dealing with Bigfoot as a creature? What do you think this creature is?
I'm a flesh and blood guy. I'm a science guy. I can't say with any definitive certainty what it is until we have an actual specimen to look at. But I can speculate based on what the evidence says, what the data says. And right off the bat, I don't think it's Gigantopithecus. There's too much going against it. And to be honest, a lot of the mainstream hardcore researchers backing off from that idea. Even Jeff Meldrum's starting to back off, is my understanding. He no longer is really supporting Giganto because the science isn't backing it up. But that being said, it is a primate. 100% sure on that. If I had to classify it, I would probably classify it as an archaic hominid. We know creatures very similar to it existed in the fossil record. We know that they were widespread across the old world. And we also know that during about 2 million years ago, there was a lot of exchange going on between the old world and the new world via the Beringia, or the land bridge.
Yeah.
Because most people don't realize buffalo actually came here during that time frame from Asia, as did the jaguars and wolves. And on the other end of the spectrum, camels came from North America into Asia, and so did cheetahs.
That's wild.
Yeah, this is, genetically speaking, mountain lions are the cheetah's closest relatives. Cheetahs are from here originally, and we have fossil cheetahs.
When I think of Oklahoma Bigfoot, you always hear these just wildly aggressive tales. Is that the case with Western Oklahoma as well, or is that more of the other side of the state?
I think a lot of these stories of aggression are misinterpretations of behavior.
Oh.
Because, okay, you get bluff charged by something, you're going to think it's trying to kill you. But in all honesty, yeah, I do think there are dangerous ones out there. Just like any animal, it's going to be unpredictable, but it's going to do what it does for a reason. And I've said this before with researchers, there are actually quite a few more reports of aggressive behavior, I think, in the western part of the state than there are the eastern, but I think it might be because the environment might be a bit more stressful. The western half gets hit with drought on a regular occasions, and there's not as much cover, so the animals are going to be stressed out. And by the way, Oklahoma is actually about 2/3 forest. Most people don't realize that. It's just one of those things. These things do what they have to survive. And if it means they have to get rough with us puny little humans, so be it.
That's really interesting. So you mentioned that there may even be more stories in the western side of the state that could be labeled more aggressive. Are there any that come to mind?
Yeah. To start off, I have actually heard stories of 2 attempted abductions.
Really?
In the western part of the state.
Oh.
And these aren't old stories either. These are within the last 20 to 30 years. There was a guy who had been out deer hunting in the Haystack Mountains, which is the far southwest corner of the state. And basically he was sleeping in the back of his truck on a pallet of blankets, and something came up and grabbed him by the leg and started to drag him out of the truck. And this is a kind of a funny story because the guy said he started kicking wildly, not knowing what it was, but when his foot made contact with a piece of anatomy that he later thought about that was notably softer, then he heard a strange howl and seen this giant hairy figure hobbling off into the bush. And then he effectively said he thinks he kicked Bigfoot in the private area.
What an amazing individual. Can you imagine just having that on like a plaque on your wall or something? That's a kind of a cool story though, because it does line up with, there's a report from the NAWAC in their area where a gentleman an arm reached through the window and starts dragging one of the individuals towards the wall. And it's almost like a modern day Albert Ostman type story too, which is cool. Oh, man, that's horrifying.
And again, the next one came from over near El Reno. There was a powwow going on, and one of the girls from the tribe was over there, and she wandered off. I say girl, she's probably a teenager, but something actually shoved her over and grabbed her by the leg and started dragging her to the woods. And she said the hand that she felt on her lower leg took up most of her lower leg. She said the palm was about the size of a frying pan. She was screaming and carrying on, and it dropped her and went off on its way. And this is a witness I personally interviewed. She didn't get a good look at it, but she thinks that's what it was a Bigfoot. And then there was the story of what we call the monster war from the late 30s out in my area. And basically what happened, there was a family living in an old Indian cabin. They were building a new home, and the farmer that owned it, and I heard all this from his grandson, who still lives in that area, or at least did a few years ago. But he said that he heard something out in his goats, and he went out there, and he had an old Sharps rifle, and he seen something in the goat pen, and he said he thought it was a bear, and he shot it, and it dropped. And he went out there, and he said it was this huge man covered in hair. And about that time, he heard roars from the woods and realized that whatever, it wasn't alone. And he proceeded to run back to the cabin, and the cabin was actually sitting up on a bunch of rocks that had been wired together to form little supports. And his family was freaking out, and something hit the side of the cabin hard enough to knock it off of those supports. And this thing proceeded to basically beat on the side of things were beating on the side of the cabin trying to get in, and they were actually shooting through the cabin at them. And the daylight came and they backed off, and the family fled to the nearest neighbor, which was about a mile away. And they almost got shot because apparently the neighbors got a visit too after that. And they said that they went back to their cabin and they immediately buried the body of the thing that they shot, because they were scared if they came back that night and it was still there, they would attack again. And then they actually poured the foundation of their house over it. And I have told them if they ever demolish that house, I will be there with a pickaxe and a shovel.
Okay. Wow. Jim, you know the people. This is crazy stuff. So they built their foundation over where they're saying a dead Bigfoot is buried. Wow.
That's the story. And like I said, I've known that family most of my life, and they've always been really honest.
Oh, wow.
I can't say for sure that it's not something that got blown out of proportion. If they ever tear that house down, I wouldn't mind taking a look to see if there's a grain of truth to the story.
Oh, absolutely. And how long ago, roughly, again, did that happen?
This would have been the 1930s.
Okay. Man, that's wild. Is there a book that, is the book for Western Oklahoma?
Nothing.
Information?
Nothing.
So, Jim, it's all in your head, because this is all stuff I've never heard before. And this is incredible information. Jim, has there ever been a time when you're out researching and just something happens and it is so intense, you're like, if I could get out of here right now, I would definitely get out of here right now? Has anything like that ever happened to you?
A couple of times. The one that stuck out to me was probably the most terrifying night of my life. See, my old farmhouse, the area I was researching at, was less than a half mile from my farmhouse. And I had a good friend of mine that had been staying with me after a nasty divorce and getting back on his feet. And he finally moved out. And at the time, I went up to an area that I referred to as the marker area, because you go up there, it's like a little isolated pocket of woods connected by streams to bigger chunks of woods, but it's up on the top of the hill, and there's a pond and the hidden spring up there. And you go up there and there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on with the trees, all kinds of possible structures and whatnot. And I'm pretty skeptical on stick structures, but when you find a tree as a green sapling that's been wrapped around another tree and tied in a knot, that's hard to explain. So I went up there, and that place tends to give me the creeps. And I went up in there, and basically I was checking the markers, looking for footprints, that kind of thing. And it didn't dawn on me, there was no sound. There was no birds, no bugs, nothing was rustling around in the leaves. And it really should have sunk in that means something was probably there. So I'm in there looking around, and I hear a crack. And I turn around and I get this it'd be a good piece of firewood. It's probably about maybe 1.5 foot long and probably about 3-4 inches thick, comes sailing in my direction. Now, looking back, it probably didn't intend to hit me. I fell on my butt and it missed. And I thought it was aiming at me. And I started hightailing it out of there. And I turned around in time to see a big silhouette backing back down the dam at the pond at the entryway to this place. And I went back to my house. Again, this is only a half mile away. My buddy who was staying out there showed up to get some stuff, and he seen I was pretty spooked. And I told him what happened, and he asked me if I wanted him to stay. And I said, nah, you can go back. You got stuff you got to do. I'll be all right. It wasn't 10, 15 minutes after he left, I actually was talking to some of the other researchers when all of a sudden my dogs went absolutely berserk. They were going nuts barking, and then they were gone. The dogs left. And I went out there and looked around, and I had a rock hit the security light. Looking back, it dawned on me that these things had waited. Number one, they knew exactly where to find me at. Because again, it's only a half mile away. So they knew where my house was. And then they waited until my buddy left. They waited for me to be alone. And I went back in the house. I was getting all excited. I'm turning off the lights, and I've got a night vision scope, and I'm running from window to window looking out. And the well house is out by the creek, and there was the pressure switch was malfunctioning, and it was making this loud clicking noise. And through the night vision, I see a dark silhouette of what looks like an ape on all fours come up. And it reaches up and grabs the door on the well house and proceeds to pull the door off. And it was checking out the source of that noise, because it was a really loud noise coming from that pressure switch. So I get excited. I'm talking on the forums, and I do want to add, the MABRC had a team in eastern Oklahoma up near Salisaw. And at that same time I'm talking to them, they're getting rocks thrown at them. Then over in Georgia, we had another expedition going on that night, and the Georgia team had been roared at, and I think they got a bluff charge. So all three of this is happening at the same time in 3 different locations. And we were talking back and forth, and I've got the night vision. I'm looking out the window, and I see the little ape looking thing come back, and then there's a second one with it. Then all of a sudden, this huge dark mass follows them. And that well house is about 8 feet tall, and whatever it was taller. And I am certain it's probably the same one that I saw across the road in 2009. About a year later. But this thing, and the people that I was actually talking with the head of the group, and he heard me go from excited to terrified in one go, because this thing was massive. And they went around there, left, and throughout the night, they came back several more times. And I got the feeling that it might have been some kind of show of strength or something. Don't quote me on that. That's pure speculation on my part, but I definitely seem to have got their interest. And when the sun was starting to come up, I hadn't slept. I was basically too worked up to sleep. And I sat down on the couch in the living room, which there's a door in the kitchen, which you can see from the living room. And I turned on the TV. I just turned it on to have background noise. I didn't know at the time what was on. But you ever have something happen and your brain takes a snapshot that's permanently etched into your brain. That's how I know that Raiders of the Lost Ark was on. Because as I'm sitting there, I see movement out the kitchen window in the pre-dawn hours. And I look to the kitchen window and a face pops up in the window looking at me. And I had a loaded shotgun beside me. Right after the big one showed up, I proceeded to load the firearms just in case. And I looked over at the shotgun, then looked at it, and then looked back at the shotgun. And its eyes got about as big around as saucers, and it proceeded to disappear. The following night, I heard all kinds of howls and stuff coming from up in the hills, and we had another researcher. He was visiting his dad, and he showed up. And I think he thought that I was making the whole thing up and everything. We went up to the marker area, and we started to come back down. And I was sitting there thinking that, okay, I got to do something because this guy thinks I'm full of crap. So I said, I'll tell you what, we'll go up and look at the markers. You can see those for yourself. And we went back up in there, and we got met at the tree line by a dark silhouette about 6-7 feet tall. Actually, it was about 7 something because I went back and measured the next day. And it had red eye shine, and it proceeded to duck under a branch and start walking in our direction. And this wasn't a bluff charge. These were almost Jason Voorhees Friday the 13th strides. Needless to say, we got out of there real fast. And that researcher, he'd go on to say that he doesn't think he's ever been as close to one as he was that night. But we got out of there. We went back down there to the bottoms. And something else of interest, my mother and my stepdad had showed up because they had talked to me and saw how scared I was the night before. And before we had went up there, Rob had played the Ohio House, the famous house, and my dog started looking around nervously. And my mother actually pointed out to him that we hear that all the time down there. We hear a little more higher pitch, but yeah, basically. Usually late at night or something, and she thought it was some kind of alarm somebody put up in a pasture or something that would go off on occasion.
So that's your mom saying that?
Yeah.
Have you given them like an audio recorder to just be like, hey, Mom, just put this out in your property? That's incredible.
They weren't living there at the time, but I've actually put audio recorders out and tried to catch it. I haven't had a whole lot of luck because you can't really predict it, and half the time the batteries will be dead, and I'm not an audio guy.
That account of what happened on your property, man, I can't imagine looking out, seeing a ape-like creature reach up, rip a door off its hinges in the outbuilding. My goodness, I don't know how you didn't just leave right there. That's wild, Jim.
There was a lot of weird stuff that happened over the years, but after I got to researching it, it all started making sense. And yeah, I still own the old place. It's starting to get so developed out in there. I don't think there's going to be activity out there for much longer.
Sure. That's too bad. That is a shame when the crazy locales start to get the suburbs creeping in around it. And boy, that's sad to hear. But man, what a story though. My goodness.
And I do want to add, I documented everything.
Okay.
I photographed the door, the well house, the markers. If I thought it was possibly connected, I documented everything.
Is that on the MABRC forums then, or?
It was on the old forums. We lost a lot of that stuff when it got hacked, but I do have all of that on my private files.
And so you're still actively researching today, sounds like.
I haven't been for the past couple years, but
okay,
that's more due to the past few years being what they've been.
A very interesting. I had no idea that Western Oklahoma has so many cool things going on regarding Bigfoot. Thank you for sharing that with our listeners. Is the MABRC the best place to find out info about that section of the state, you think?
We don't have a lot on our forums about it, but I'll talk at the symposiums and whatnot that we have every year.
Sure.
And I'm usually more than happy to share the information with people that we've got. And I consider that part of the state kind of one of the last frontiers for research because everybody's been ignoring it. And to be honest, some of the best action I've actually gotten was in the northwest corner of the state. And I've researched all over the state at this point. I've been to the northeast corner up in the Ozarks. I've been down to the southeast corner in the swamps and in the Kiamichi Mountains. And I honestly think that these things catch on really quick to the fact that the people are there for them. And when you go to places that everybody's ignored, like the stuff in the western part of the state, it's almost like it's a little easier to get stuff. And again, I want to mention everybody talks about LaFleur County being really the hot spot, but there's the population for that county is 40, 50,000. Whereas you can go out to the other end of the state and you've got a county with a population of 2,000 that's just as big. That tells you exactly the difference in how the areas are. You just can't see the towns and the other houses in the eastern part of the state because of the trees.
That's interesting. But you have researched on the eastern side of the state, though?
Oh, yeah. I have researched pretty much all over Oklahoma at this point. I have also researched in Arkansas and Texas.
Oh, wow. Have you ever been to an area called McGee Creek?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I actually did some stuff there for the Oklahoma Academy of Science when I was working on that, but I haven't researched there. However, I have researched at Boggy Depot, which is not too far from there. I take it back. Yeah, I did do a little research at McGee Creek. I forgot.
So the Boggy Depot, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's one of the oldest. There's nothing there now. It's a park, but it used to be one of the oldest town sites in the state. And that's an interesting place.
The Boggy Depot or McGee Creek?
Boggy Depot.
Okay. Just Bigfoot related, it's interesting, or in general, it's just a really...
I would argue in general. But yeah, there is a history of Bigfoot activity down there. I've got a spot I like to go to down near Antlers that's been pretty good. Then Of course, I've got a spot down in McCurtain County I like to go to too. And that's one area that this particular area tends to have a lot of activity going on.
Oh, yeah. If someone was to, let's say there's a listener and they're like, oh, I want to go Bigfooting in Oklahoma. There are so many options. It's almost to the point where it's like, you don't even know where to start. Do you recommend West Side or the East Side?
It's hard to say. It just depends on what you're wanting to do, I would say. If something I've done that's actually worked out really well for me is I like to look into sightings that I call are not from traditional sources.
Okay.
One of the things I'll do is I'll comb the paranormal sighting reports, because I'm not saying Bigfoot's paranormal, but a lot of people, especially with all these ghost hunting shows, anything weird they see out in the woods gets called a ghost. So you can go and somebody will say, yeah, I saw the ghost of the mountain man that lived over near Ada. And they said he's 8 foot tall and hairy. And you can go there and start reading the comments that the people are writing, because a lot of these places will let people post comments about what people have saw. And when you start reading stuff like, yeah, the ghost got into my ice box and stole my ham and then threw rocks at me, and he was covered in a bear skin and he was 7 feet tall, and you start reading this stuff over and over, chances are that's going to be a good Bigfoot spot to go to. And I've had a lot of luck finding some research spots doing that.
That's really good advice, actually. I've never heard that type of advice, but I like that. I think I might check that out myself for my own state. I like that.
It's no longer there, but one of the sites I would actually recommend using, there was you can use the Wayback Machine and get onto it. It was called strangeusa.com.
Okay.
And you just find you one of those stories about a haunted road or whatever, and then just start reading the comments that people will put in there. And yeah, that can lead you straight to a really good spot.
Mm-hmm. That's a good idea as well. You mentioned LaFleur County earlier, so I do want to hit on it. Have you ever researched in LaFleur County?
Not much. I've done some research in Pushmataha. One of my first research sites was actually about 6 miles west of Honubby, just off Wild Horse Creek. And I don't research there anymore because they put in a dirt track racing course just across the creek from it. But that was a place that I was getting some good stuff from. And I do want to say it's interesting. There's a old legend about a guy named LaFleur in southeast Oklahoma that supposedly got into a fist fight with a Bigfoot in the 1830s. And the old LaFleur cabin is actually on the property that I was staying at.
Oh, wow.
It's still standing. I actually would camp in it. The guy that owns it moved the old Honubby schoolhouse down there, and he uses that for his cabin, but he used the old one for storage. And whenever I was out there, I just pitch a tent in it.
Tall tale, or you think there's some truth to that?
I think he might have saw something getting into his corn. I think that part of it's probably true. But I'm going to say the whole him getting into a fist fight with a Bigfoot is probably an exaggeration, you know. And and again, you see that in modern day too. I touched on the ghost thing. I've got a sneaking suspicion a lot of what people see out in the woods they have preconceived notions. And when they see something outside of those notions, their brain tries to fill in the blanks with whatever they're interested in. There was actually a case from Gaither Mountain, Arkansas, where you had two sightings less than a week apart by two different deer hunters. And what had happened, the first deer hunter happened to be really into aliens. And, he was a big fan, watched all the ancient alien shows and whatnot. And he goes out into the woods and he claims that he saw two gray aliens that were covered in hair. And he said he knows they were aliens because he had missing time. The second guy said he saw, I seen two Bigfoot. And they clearly saw the same thing. It was just a week apart in the exact same area. But the first guy was convinced they were aliens. And to be honest, I don't think he had missing time. I think he probably fainted.
That's
what
funny,
hunter is going to admit he fainted?
Totally. Oh, man. That's wild. Yeah. I think you might be onto something there. You'd mentioned Honabi earlier. Just a shot in the dark. Were you involved in any way with the siege events 20 years ago?
No.
Okay. I
was familiar with the story, and I had actually been in the area around the time of it, but it was not, this is before I was doing Bigfoot research. I was actually going down there and collecting samples of plants and amphibians for the college.
Oh, that's interesting. But I'm guessing you probably still heard about it, even though you're in a field at that time.
Not until actually after it happened.
Okay.
But but I was doing a lot of stuff. Every spring I'd go down there and spend a couple of weeks in that area doing field work. This is part of a project I had going for the college. As I was a lonely biology student at the time.
Jim, I'll ask you one more question before we wrap up, and I really want to thank you for your time tonight. What do you feel that the best Bigfoot evidence to come out of Oklahoma so far is?
That's funny because I just did a presentation at the last symposium called Oklahoma's Best Evidence.
Oh, in Stillwell?
Yeah. In my opinion, the hair, I would consider the hair sample stuff to be really interesting. And the North American Wood Ape Conservancy's Tag 7 is also very intriguing. But the one that stands out for me at the top of the list, people always say Bigfoot evidence cannot stand up to scientific scrutiny. But in Oklahoma, there was a piece of evidence that did. The chicken man handprint from the 1970s. It was supposed to be over near El Reno. It actually happened just across the river, not too far from a place called Cougar, depending on how you want to announce it. But this handprint, something had been raiding this guy's chicken house, and he found a handprint on it. And he called the cops, and the cops came out and dusted it. And they were confused, so they called wildlife biologists to come out and look at it. Then the wildlife biologist contacted the Oklahoma City Zoo, and they sent a primatologist out. So you've got forensics experts looking at it. You've got wildlife biologists looking at it, and then you've got a primatologist looking at it. And they were trying to debunk that handprint. They tried, keyword tried. The official conclusion they all came up with was it belonged to a herefore unknown species of primate.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's the official conclusion on the chicken man handprint. And of course, they got the name because it was raiding hen houses. And what was really interesting is Dr. Lawrence Curtis from the Oklahoma City Zoo was really intrigued by this because he'd been secretly looking into other reports. And he said the anatomy on the handprint was a mix between a more primitive hand than a human's, but he said it's very similar to other prints he had been looking at that had been found in places like Stillwater, Stillwell, Southeast Oklahoma, Missouri. And he was of the opinion there might truly be an unidentified primate in the region. And like I said, since that's basically the official stance on what the Chicken Man handprint was, the fact is it remains one of the pieces that actually took a scientific pounding and came out on top.
Wow. I'm going to need to look more into that. That is awesome. Has that been talked about in any books that you found? Or?
Oh yeah, Lauren Coleman has talked about it. He tries to use it as the part of the evidence for his North American ape hypothesis. But you can find pictures of the print on the Cryptomundo website, but you could also look on newspapers.com and find information about it. And like I said, the whole case is very interesting. The Chicken Man flap was probably one of the biggest cases ever in Oklahoma. It's right up there with the Noxie monster. And in part, that's because of Fate magazine actually did a special on it.
Interesting. Very interesting. I'm going to have to do a little digging into that. That'll be fun. The Chicken Man Bigfoot of 1970s Oklahoma. That sounds like something I would like. I like 1970s Bigfoot in Iowa, so why not 1970s Oklahoma Bigfoot? Jim, this has been a fascinating chat about Western Oklahoma and some other parts as well. Thank you so much for coming on tonight.
It was a pleasure.
Before we go, can you share with the listeners, is there any way to keep up to date with what you're doing? Are you a guy in the shadows, or how can they contact you if they have information about your area of Oklahoma, all that good stuff?
You can probably contact me on Facebook fairly easily enough. As far as being a public voice, I used to be a little bit more proactive, but I've been trying to avoid the politics part of it because I tend to prefer to be out in the woods doing the research. That's honestly one of the reasons I don't do a lot of talks on podcasts anymore.
Yeah. And again, I'm super thankful for you agreeing to come on to Bigfoot Society. It's been a great chat. There's plenty of rabbit trails from this conversation for listeners to start going down to find some really cool history tidbits to do with Bigfoot. But Jim, thank you so much again for coming on tonight.
It was fun. If
you'd like to make a special one-time donation to Bigfoot Society, you can head on over to the Buy Me a Coffee page. I'd like to shout out Brian Corbin this week for buying 5 coffees, which will greatly help with our upcoming trip to Monster Fest in beautiful Canton, Ohio. His message says, "Can't wait to hear how Monster Fest goes." I'll be sharing that with the Patreon, of which Brian is also a member. Rock on, Brian. You're a great guy. The link for Buy Me a Coffee, along with everything else, is in the show notes. Thank you for listening tonight. Become a supporting member of the Bigfoot Society podcast by going to www.patreon.com/the Bigfoot Society and receive extra episodes and early ad-free episodes as well. If you've got a personal Bigfoot encounter you would like to submit for me to share on the podcast, please head on over to www.bigfootsocietypodcast.com. There you'll find the Share Your Bigfoot Encounter form a little lower on the page, and please take a minute to share as many details as you can. Please state if the encounter is anonymous or what name you would like associated with the encounter. And as always, thanks for listening.